Soil is incredibly important because all of life above ground would not be there without that life underground.
We often poison soils or damage soils, and yet we are entirely dependent on them. It's the microbiome of the planet. Welcome, everyone, to Speaking Naturally. I have the amazing pleasure of interviewing today a gentleman who shares my last name, Verkerk, and he lives in the country from which I originate, which is the Netherlands, and he is in fact my brother, Mark Verkerk, a filmmaker. So, Mark, welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so look, the reason why we're talking to Mark today is that he is the director of what I think is an extraordinary film. It's called Planet Soil. And I believe it's the first time that the soil and all the beasties within it have been filmed in great detail. I was lucky enough to be invited by the Dutch embassy to the first screening showing of it in the UK, in London, 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I have to admit, I wasn't expecting to be reduced to tears, but it is a deeply emotional film. It really shows us this extraordinary world that exists beneath our feet, a world that we have tended to disrespect in many respects. We build, cities over the top of it, and we often poison soils or damage soils, and yet we are entirely dependent on them. So Planet Soil is out. I want to talk to Mark in some detail, and of course it is all filmed in the Netherlands, and many of you will be aware that the Netherlands has been one of the starting points for farmer protests. And Mark, if we can kick off by just understanding a little bit about the grievances that farmers have had, why they have been so concerned about what's been going on. Government has been involved, and of course the word government in the Netherlands is a confusing concept because it seems half the time you don't know who is governing you. So it all kicked off in 2019. What happened?
Yeah, well, it is a it is a complicated story, the whole thing. To try to simplify it a little bit, it's a story that goes back actually 30 years, more than 30 years, when the EU started to put limits on the emissions of nitrogen, and that was specifically being aimed at sort of artificial nitrogen in fertilizers, but also in the sort of waste of intensive animal farming, because of the problems this was causing in the general environment, in water systems, even in the sea. Holland at the time were able to get a sort of a pass on those regulations, and they said, okay, because of the nature of how intensive the farming is in the Netherlands, they said, look, can we have a bit more time to be able to do this? And so at that time, it was originally 10 years given. That it was extended 3 times. And what happened politically, they came out very, very clumsily, I think, in 2019, with suddenly realizing that they were going to have to meet these EU targets, and just announcing to farmers that this had to be done very quickly, and any farmer who wasn't able to manage this was going to be potentially bought out or would have to close.
And that would have basically roughly halved the amount of livestock farming in the Netherlands.
Correct.
So
yeah.
And of course, so synthetic nitrogen is going in obviously via fertilizers, nitrogen that's then been recycled through animals is coming in. And of course, nitrogen can also be put naturally into soils through green manures. I mean, it's what regenerative farmers are doing. So it's really the fertilizer companies. Now, what is really fascinating is that to get this passed from the EU that they've had for the last 10 years is the result of the extreme intensity of farming in the Netherlands, is it not? And that has evolved over the last 1,000 years or so, because am I right in thinking you had made a film on this about the Delta country that where this intensive agricultural system, the fact that you have a very significant proportion of the land area below sea level, which required the development of the polder systems and the dike systems, it has really only been able to be supported because you've got this incredible nutrient flows that have come down the Rhine system, and but that eventually runs out, and I gather in order to prop up that level of intensity, there's been a requirement to engage with synthetic fertilizers at a pretty major level. And the problem also is when you put a lot of nitrogen into the soil synthetically like that, you destabilize the microbial communities. And we know that living soils are entirely dependent really on healthy microbial communities, as your film so shows. So is that the kind of pattern? And obviously you have a huge amount of livestock farming as well, more so than arable. And then you have a lot of glasshouse farming.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think all around the world, delta systems are the sort of some of the most fertile areas in the world, and Holland is basically at the bottom end of the largest river system in Europe, and had an enormous benefit from that for centuries, as you say. And it is particularly since the Second World War. The Second World War was there was famine in the last year of the war, and I think when at the end of that war, there was this sort of feeling that this is never going to happen again in the Netherlands, and that's where the enormous sort of kick in intensive farming really started. And then, of course, we've seen the development of industrial agriculture all over the world. But essentially, we end up with a system that's now growing very little food for humans. Essentially, it's largely an exports-based system.
I've heard you use the expression before, the farmers being the meat in the sandwich. The solution isn't straightforward, because on one hand you've got a big push generally, and in fact the EU has a strategy on moving towards agroecological farming systems in which livestock can be a component. But one of the problems is once you've sort of got so used to such levels of intensity, reducing intensity isn't an easy process. And so in terms of the livestock farming, from everything from cattle through to pork and poultry, etc., is most of that, is a big significant part of that for export, or is it all for consumption by the Dutch themselves?
No, the vast majority of it is for export. Yeah, both the meat and milk production. Milk production is again, don't quote me exactly on these figures, but it's in the proportion of 75 to 80% of it is export. So no, I think there's a tremendous public support for farmers here, because they are very much seen as a kind of meat in the sandwich. They've been pushed essentially by government, by economics really, of big agriculture to constantly intensify, and they've consequently built, I think, basically some of the most intensive farming practices in the world.
And also some of the most sophisticated water management systems anywhere, water conservation, because so much of the Netherlands is below sea level.
Below sea level.
And some of that pork, I gather, that really surprised me when I heard some of that pork ends up in northern Italy in Parma. And I mean, what's the statistic there?
As I understand it, that is there's approximately 80% of the Parma ham that's produced in Parma in Italy is actually raised in the Netherlands. It's a little bit of an indication of a little bit of how crazy our whole food system has become, I think, globally speaking.
Absolutely.
And so unconnected from sort of biophysical reality.
Yeah.
And what we're trying with this film to do is just to bring a little bit more, just to bring some awareness of really where it all comes from, where it all starts from, because it is a very abstract concept, the idea of soil and a healthy soil. We don't pay too much attention. We walk on it all the time, but it's very much it stays abstract, and it's a lot of the discussions are quite scientific about levels of this and levels of that. But ultimately, it's actually not so as complex, really. I think we, as humans, we have a tremendous need or an instinct to try to control every single thing.
Yeah.
And I
provide
think
the right resources and the right environment, nature tends to sort itself out and find a way of building, equilibrium through complexity. And I mean, there's no doubt that the soil ecosystem is a complex ecosystem. One of the difficulties is that we can't see it very easily. Humans tend to spend a lot of time focusing on the things that they can see. It's one of the reasons we have big problems environmentally in the oceans as well, because of acidification. And you are working on a film currently on the North Sea. So look, let's, in fact, just before we move to looking at the film itself, can you just give us a feel for because the protests are ongoing in the Netherlands. There are also other farmer protests in other parts of Europe, in France and Germany, etc., often for differing reasons. But am I right in thinking the farmers are still protesting now? They still have ongoing grievances because the situation hasn't been sorted for them at all.
What happened at the end of those initial protests in 2019 was that the government kind of sort of stepped back and said, "Oh, okay, let's have a bit of a think about this." So there's been a bit more time, sort of, but essentially nothing has really nothing really has changed in terms. So it's a sort of standoff situation. Meanwhile, through slightly different triggers, you see protests popping up in many other countries in Europe, in Germany, in France, in Spain, in Italy, most recently in Belgium. And they're all slightly different triggers. In Germany, the trigger was subsidies were taken away from the diesel. The diesel subsidy was taken away. In France, they were more concerned really about the influx of cheap exports from abroad. But it's all to do with the fact that basically farmers all over Europe are financially absolutely, in Dutch you say, the water has reached your lip.
Yeah, there's no leeway. There's no leeway.
Whenever there's a sort of pressure, and especially, there's this big regulatory body in the EU sort of saying, yeah, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to do. I think there's still quite a long way before this sort of turns into a much more constructive discussion, because essentially some kind of change is going to be necessary. Essentially, these enormous inputs into soil is essentially sterilizing the soil. The plants grow for a short while quite well, but they don't then need the connections with all the other soil organisms. That falls away.
we're slowly poisoning the oceans, poisoning the air, and we're definitely poisoning the soil. But of course, the soil is so much less evident. So this is why Planet Soil is such a key film. Um, Obviously, what you've done is totally amazing. Certainly enough to reduce many of us who watched it to tears, and it has an amazing soundtrack that really draws you into understanding the complexity of what's going. Now, how did the film actually get born? What were the triggers in you actually deciding to make this film?
It was actually well before the farmer protests. We were. It's something that had kind of been on the radar for some time in terms of the last 10, 12 years, been focusing the films on wildlife and the natural world and the human nature connection. And soil is something that's kind of I think it's been rising in general awareness around the world anyway, that people saying, yeah, we need to pay much more attention to that. I always found it a fascinating subject, but really, really difficult to think of how you can actually make a film about it. It's slightly more suited to maybe a book or some other form of.
I mean, you look at the number of books that have come out that really are bringing to life the importance of the mycorrhizal fungi and the communication networks. Very nice when you see it in text. As a filmmaker, it must be pretty challenging. So, tell us. Okay, so I think you had the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN,
what triggered this particular film was a request from the IUCN, the very first, I think, isn't it? Very first conservation organization.
Yeah, absolutely.
Set up after the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And still really one of the more effective ones, I think, because of their regional scope.
And really still a big focus on biodiversity. And of course, if you don't have biodiversity in the soil, it's actually very difficult to have it anywhere else. So
Right.
it is the starting point for everything. So it's a fantastic reason to be making this film. So what were your first thoughts about how on earth you were going to film what happens in the soil? And can you just take us through some of the sort of technical challenges in actually doing that? Because we certainly spend the entire film looking into the soil and seeing live beasties, rotifers and mites and earthworms and springtails and all sorts of wonderful fauna, as well as all the fungi. Quite incredible, beautiful lighting. How on earth was that accomplished?
One thing was actually from the very beginning was that to be able to sort of take people underground and actually sort of give a sort of sense of all the life that's down there. That was definitely one important element, just to, because when you see something, it's really quite different than if somebody just tells you about things. So that's. But the other thing was to put it in relationship with humans and not maybe the more classical wildlife approach, which is often to separate the natural world from the human world, as though it sort of exists in this sort of separate place. But particularly with soil, that connection really with humans was so important. So there's two kind of parallel storylines. We follow really a plot of ground that is sort of developing over 2 years underground, but also above ground, what's happening with the human community that's also sort of slowly developing.
That creates the most amazing connection with those people. They're kind of almost wannabe regen ag farmers working on a small plot, but the level of excitement and the kind of emotional investment that occurs in the soil and all the progeny from that soil. And then, my goodness, when it gets to harvest time, the celebration that occurs, which I think you can see in the trailers, is fantastic. I mean, as a viewer, you get completely drawn in to the wonders of the entire process. So how did you get cameras to film all of that?
That was the big challenge, obviously. And so, the first thing is actually just to go out and try and pull together a team of people who can do this, because one of the biggest challenges, really, with the soil is just the enormous range in scale of all the different lifestyles. So you've got things which you can see quite easily, like earthworms, and then you sort of jump down to another scale to springtails and mites and things like that. You can just see them with the naked eye, but a lot of them you can't. But this whole system is actually made up of such a complex mix of different organisms, and they're all at enormously different scales. So it's not like walking out into the woods and just filming the birds or something like that. And
which is hard enough.
Which is hard enough, yeah. So we had to kind of divide, choose sort of different scales to try and focus on, and then find people who had expertise in that area. So anyway, at the top level, it is much more conventional type of filming. You're working essentially with macro lenses, with normal cameras and so forth. The challenges start when you start to get into the micro world, working a lot with scientists, soil scientists who are working with these creatures, every day. But one of the things we realized fairly quickly was that basically they work essentially with dead animals. They kill the animals before they look at them under the microscopes to do all the determination and work that they're doing like that. And that was, of course, of absolutely no use for the film. We weren't interested in filming the dead animals. So we had to come up with a system, and eventually we worked out a kind of system where with plastic containers, which had a slice of soil in them. You could keep them sort of in the soil, so you could keep that whole system alive, and you could take it out in one sort of slice, be able to put it underneath the microscope for a short period of time, because again, most of these creatures are not very happy to be in the light and all this sort of stuff. So that system can then go back in again, and you can go back into the soil and continue living.
Yeah.
And made it possible to be able to follow sort of processes over a longer period of time, because that's always the challenge. And a lot of these processes is not only that they're small, but they also to actually see anything happening takes a good amount of time. That's particularly with when you're trying to sort of visualize fungi and so forth.
And for I think very, very good reason, you decided not to compare these healthy living soils with dead, chemically treated, fertilizer treated soils, because I guess you wouldn't have seen very much. But in the Q&A that we had after the London showing, you did explain that you did consider it, but also felt you had concerns about polarizing people even further. So just take us through your thinking there. We live in a highly polarized world, and a lot of people will see particular pieces of information and either reject them if they don't conform with their own views, or allow that new information just to reinforce even further. So the net effect is zero, which is why it is so difficult overcoming polarization. You've done something different here, because you show the glory, the wonders of living soils. And I think would I be right in thinking that a conventional farmer that might be applying, say, a herbicide or a fungicide, or even driving a very heavy tractor over the soil, might, having seen the film, think twice about, is there another way of doing this? So that was a conscious decision, I gather. Is that right?
It was a very much a conscious decision. First of all, also not to put farmers or farming in the center of the film. To try to broaden, try to broaden that sort of contact between humans and the soil. It is obviously farming is a major, point at which that happens, but not to make it into a farming issue, which again sort of puts it, immediately pigeonholes it in one way, and a lot of people then have all kinds of pre-existing views about that. The main focus is this group who have a vegetable garden, a sort of simple small vegetable garden, but we go and look at people who are building parks in cities.
And you talked to a number of the scientists who
forests and a number of scientists, without getting very into huge detail of the science. But we wanted to also to be able to give a bit of light to that thing. I think it is extremely important at the moment, in exactly what you say. If we want to affect any kind of change, to try to get out of to try to sidestep this whole polarization that exists. And it became, during the production of the film, I mean, we were 4 years in production, so it's particularly because of the difficulties of the filming.
Some of the time-lapse filming in there is incredible, and my goodness, it must have taken an awful lot of time to be able to build some of those sequences, to see the changes that we see literally pass through the screen in seconds. That must have taken hours, days, weeks, to
months.
Yeah,
some of those shots literally are taking months. Yeah.
Incredible. So look, one of the other really important things about a film like this is its ability to influence young people, who are, after all, going to be the next generation. You have created a junior version, and am I right in thinking in the Netherlands you already have take up by the educational system? And I know that's happened with some of your other films as well. So how have you kind of formatted the film to make it relevant to children?
Yeah, we have made in this case a special version of the film. It's slightly shorter, because the 83 minutes is quite a long sit for kids, but also, it doesn't fit into sort of school programs very easily. So it's around 60 minutes. It can also be broken down into smaller bits if needed. A large part of the film itself is a visual. The main film is a sort of visual journey, a sort of visual exploration, with some explanation through voiceover and interviews from people. For the kids version, there is much more explanation. So we have a sort of more conventional voiceover that takes you through explaining things. So in a way that's much more easy to understand for an audience of we aim it at sort of between 10 and 15 years. It's sort of 10 years old to 15 years.
Amazing.
And we mix the footage that you see in the film, which is the people who are developing this garden, some of the scientists, a farmer who's working regenerative on a much larger scale. So those elements that you had in the main film, with a whole lot of filming of children doing managing gardens themselves in a school situation. So you have a system in Holland, the schooltuin, so the school gardens, which is essentially
part of the curriculum.
It's part of the curriculum at the end of primary school. Yeah, all kids for 1 year manage a small garden. Each child one small garden.
Hallelujah.
And that's it's in itself a great thing. But you see,
They've been doing that for 100 years and created the most intensive agricultural system in the world as a result of it. It's fantastic, isn't it? Now they've got a problem.
Well, it's interesting. It's so separate, really, from that agricultural system. That agricultural system is really nothing anymore to do with
No, but look, it's a fantastic program, and so Planet Soil now is being taken on as part of the curriculum. It's going to be available to Dutch school children across the country, isn't it?
From that's right. From the beginning of the next school year, the film will be available for all how do you call it? All primary schools in Holland. So that's like 6,000 schools.
Amazing. So that's quite a contrast to the fact that you also had last year major cinema release of the film. How did it fare? Tell us how it fared in Dutch cinemas. A film on the soil.
The soil. Well,
and it's got to compete with Barbie and other films like that.
Yes, we didn't quite score as well as Barbie or Oppenheimer, but we were the best scoring documentary in cinemas last year in Holland.
Amazing. So we're now looking at the international release. Taking the film outside of the Netherlands. That presumably is something that will be ongoing for a period of years potentially, because the film won't go out of date. And I gather the primary way that it will be released internationally won't be via major cinema releases, but through showings and affiliates and Planet Soil ambassadors. I mean, there's going to be a lot of people interested in becoming part of it. So it becomes almost a kind of democratized system of release. Can you tell us a bit about how that is going to work?
What we're trying to do with the film is for it to have really as much impact as possible, to reach as many people as possible. Non-fiction documentary programming is at a tremendous disadvantage in the conventional distribution world. We are lucky in the Netherlands to have a bit of a tradition of documentaries in cinemas, so there's some possibility in the Netherlands, but most countries that's completely impossible. And in any case, you get sort of shoved into a sort of entertainment sort of area where the film is not really doing the work that it can be doing. And I think one of the reasons why it did well in Holland also was that it was very much supported by a lot of organizations and people who are working in this area. So they mobilized a lot of interest for it. There are a tremendous number of people working in this area, and what we have discovered really is that people get enthusiastic about it because it's a subject that hasn't really been visualized before, and it is a lot easier as part of your communication to have pictures and images and stories that support what you're talking about. It can get quite dry and quite scientific in terms of a discussion. So what we're trying to do is for the film to be able to be used in that way.
It's definitely not dry. It's very moist. It's got lots of moist.
Healthy soil is very moist.
Yeah, lots of beasties in it, and that's a remarkable thing. How you've managed to bring in this emotional element. We know with behavior change, one of the things that has to happen, there has to be a state change, an emotional state change before behaviors change. So to create a film about the soil that does that, certainly when you see it on a decent sized screen with a good sound system, and so if people are watching it on their own systems, I mean, the soundtrack was an amazing part of it. would you recommend that they, have a decent sound system or put earphones in or whatever?
Absolutely, absolutely. It is. It's a documentary, but it is really designed for cinema viewing. So as big a screen as possible, and please a decent sound system, because now half the story is a little bit is in the soundtrack.
Yeah. The thing is, it's watching Planet Soil is not just about watching it, it's about listening to it. It is what I would call the Planet Soil experience. So bottom line is that people will be able to receive links through affiliates and ambassadors all over the world. That is the idea. And at the moment, there is an English language version, as well as an English subtitled version. Is the plan to bring it out in other languages as well? The Italians, the French, the Spanish are all interested in this subject as well. Is that the plan, to get it into other languages as well? Has that happened?
Absolutely, absolutely. At the moment, we're still sort of starting out essentially with the sort of international, putting the film out internationally. But there's a lot of interest, for instance, in India is another large country with tremendous discussion going on at the moment about agriculture and how that's changing from the traditional methods, and there's a huge interest there. So so the Hindi version is at the moment.
Vandana Shiva is already directly involved with Planet Soil in terms of rolling it out in India, I gather, which is fantastic.
I don't know about rolling it out, but she's a supporter of the film. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, which is amazing.
One of the things I found most rewarding was really a series of screenings that we organized in farms in all the 12 provinces around the country, and these were being hosted by a farmer. Often it's somebody who was involved in sort of regenerative approaches, but not always. But the idea was to bring people from all around the surrounding areas, and that's the interesting thing with something like a film as a tool in sort of fostering discussion. It's a fairly neutral sort of ground that you can bring people together with, and it was extraordinary to see these discussions of farmers who lived. They worked quite close to each other, one in a very intensive way, and the other was sort of pioneering a sort of more regenerative approach. Had nothing to say to each other, they always thought, because you're just doing something doesn't mean anything to me. But we're having these amazing conversations about soil and how basically that's the root of it all.
Soil, water, air, sunlight, some of the vital things that we take for granted. And we have big challenges in all of those, and some of those are relating to some of the roles that technology places, and how the views about the impacts of technology, and also how technology has damaged these fundamental substrates that we need for life on the planet. We've kind of devalued them. So this is an extraordinarily important film. So Mark, it's been such an amazing pleasure talking with you. Just I'd like to just ask you one question. It's been a 4-year journey. Are there some really surprising, memorable things, or in fact just one? What is one of the most memorable things during this extraordinary 4-year journey of making Planet Soil?
Well, apart from the enormous privilege of getting to know these little beasties much better than I'd ever imagined, I think one of the most surprising things really was when we did a screening at Wageningen University, which is like sort of a top agricultural college.
I used to collaborate with them while I was with Imperial College. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You know them well. Anyway, these are so, and it was primarily for a group of soil scientists. So these are people who have been working, 20, 30 years with all of the things that that we were looking at. And they had helped a tremendous amount in the making of the film, advising on certain things. But was seeing a number of these scientists at the end of the screening with tears running down their face, sort of just so moved to see the whole thing alive, because so much of science nowadays, unfortunately, is it's either sort of spreadsheets going through reams and reams of data and trying to find patterns in that through DNA testing or whatever it is. It's quite removed from the old situation where people actually observed and looked at what was going on.
Most of our work, I visited with the head of my research group. We visited our labs only a few months back, and have seen that all the GLC spectrophotometers and mass spectrometers, everything is removed. The basins and the gas taps are still there in the labs, but basically the labs are just surrounded by computer screens and computers, because the entire group has moved to in silico research.
Goodness.
Where you're
Yeah.
not looking at,
No.
all glass houses are in the process of being demolished. So, I mean, massive changes in the way that, but what a fantastic thing to have experienced. And that's one of the reasons that this sort of emotional impact of this film is so important. So, it's a huge privilege that ANH has been appointed an ambassador to the film. Whether the director was my brother or not, that is irrelevant. We are here. This is fundamental, understanding what goes on beneath our feet and getting that right, and understanding the need to connect more to living soils and to regenerate and create living soils is fundamental to natural health. It is where it all starts. So you will find links below how you can see the film. We're thrilled to be bringing on a range of partners in all the areas that we connect around the world. So we really hope that releasing Planet Soil as widely as we can and facilitating Planet Soil's distribution around the world is going to seed some major change in how we look after soils. So, Mark, thank you so much for talking to us on Speaking Naturally.
Great pleasure, Rob. And we hope that that the film has more life in it, because I know that there's certainly sort of more versions to come. It would be, I think, next step is also to try to essentially this focus on the microbes that essentially kind of rule life on this planet. We need to start to sort of think of them in a much more connected way, and we've got some now we've got this sort of awareness of the microbiome in the gut, but there's much more of a microbiome, of course, around us and on us that keeps us going.
It's the microbiome of the planet.
It's the whole planet, isn't it? It is all connected. So soil is incredibly important, because essentially all of life above ground essentially would not be there without that life underground.
Yeah.
But we're all basically part of this microbiome. Yeah, we need to get to know these beasties a bit better.
Absolutely. So thank you. And of course, the grassroots, excuse the pun, are going to be crucial in making that happen. So thanks so much, Mark. We'll talk again.
Thank you.